The night was dark and the small town streets were almost empty. Shops had closed and windows showed only weak candlelight. But down in the old market square, something unusual was happening. A secret auction. A place where people sold strange things hidden from the law. John, a lonely man with tired eyes, walked slowly into the square. He had no reason to be there, but something inside pushed him forward. His life was empty, filled with long days of silence and long nights of loneliness. Maybe curiosity brought him here. Maybe fate. The crowd gathered close around a wooden stage. The auctioneer, a fat man with a loud voice, shouted prices into the night. Old tools, broken machines, and even wild animals were sold. People clapped, laughed, and bargained like it was just a game. John stayed at the edge, watching quietly. His heart was heavy, but his eyes searching for something he could not name. Then the crowd grew louder, and the auctioneer smiled like he had saved the best for last. He clapped his hands, and two men dragged a figure onto the stage. The figure was small, thin, and weak. Her head was covered with a rough sack tied around her neck with rope. Her hands were tied and her feet stumbled as the men pushed her forward. The crowd laughed. Some shouted cruel jokes, calling her useless. "She is nothing, just trash," someone yelled. But John felt a strange pull in his heart. He could not look away. The auctioneer raised his hand. "Tonight we sell this strange girl," he shouted. $3. Who will pay $3? The crowd laughed harder. Some turned away, not interested. Who would want such a broken thing? John stepped closer without thinking. His chest felt tight, his mind whispered, "Don't do it." But his heart refused to listen. The girl stood silently, not moving, not speaking. Only her thin shoulders trembled under the sack. John imagined what her eyes might look like behind that rough cloth. Was she crying? Was she scared? $3? The auctioneer shouted again. The crowd stayed silent. Nobody wanted her. Nobody cared. The air was cold, and the silence grew heavier. Then John's voice broke the silence. "I'll pay," he said softly, but clear. The crowd turned to stare at him. A few laughed, others shook their heads. "What a fool," someone whispered. The auctioneer grinned and slammed his hand on the table. "Sold for $3. The men pushed the girl off the stage and handed her to John. Her body was light as if she had not eaten for days. She stumbled, and John caught her before she could fall. For a moment, he felt her shaking. Her fear was real. He gave the $3 with a trembling hand. The crowd quickly lost interest and turned back to the next item. But John and the girl were already walking away. The street outside the market was quiet. Only the sound of the girl's footsteps beside him filled the silence. Her head was still covered and she made no sound. John wanted to speak, but he could not find the words. Why had he done this? Why spend the last of his money on a stranger? He did not know, but deep inside he felt this was not a mistake. He led her back to his small house at the edge of town. It was old and broken, with only a single lamp burning. He opened the door and guided her inside. The room smelled of wood, smoke and dust, but it was warmer than the streets. Slowly, carefully, John untied the rope and pulled the sack from her head. What he saw froze him in place. Her face was not like any face he had ever seen. Her skin was pale with a faint glow, her eyes large and shining like stars. She was not human. John stepped back, his breath catching. Fear rose in him, but so did wonder. The girl looked at him with wide eyes, filled with sadness, filled with silence. She did not speak, but her gaze spoke more than words. John understood one thing. This girl was lost, alone, and broken, and for $3 fate had placed her in his hands. That night, John sat in his chair, watching her sit quietly by the fire. Questions filled his mind. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she sold like an object? He had no answers, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same again. The lonely man who had walked into the market with nothing now had a secret that could change everything. The girl with the sack on her head was not just a stranger. She was a mystery and maybe the beginning of a story greater than he could imagine. The fire burned low in the corner of John's small house, the weak flames throwing shadows on the walls. The strange girl sat near it, her knees pulled close to her chest. Her eyes shone faintly in the dim light, and her pale skin reflected the glow like moonlight on water. John had never seen anything like her. He could not look away. His heart was beating fast, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something he could not explain. She did not speak, not even a single word. Her silence was heavy, yet it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that carried hidden stories, broken memories, and pain too deep to share. John wanted to ask her questions, but his mouth stayed closed. He feared that if he spoke too quickly, she would vanish like smoke in the wind. For now, he only offered her a piece of bread and a cup of water. She took them with small, careful hands. Her fingers trembled as if she did not trust the world around her. As she ate slowly, John studied her face. Her large eyes were filled with something more than fear. They were filled with sadness, like someone who had lost everything. He wondered if she was young or old, human or something else entirely. Every answer only gave birth to more questions. Yet one thing was clear. She was fragile, and she was not safe in this world. The night grew colder, but John gave her his only blanket. She wrapped it around herself and leaned against the wall. Her breathing softened, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. Watching her, John felt something unusual. It was not pity. It was not just curiosity. It was the first spark of connection he had felt in years. He whispered softly to himself, "You are not trash," no matter what they said. When morning came, John found her standing by the window. Her hands rested on the wooden frame, and her eyes gazed at the rising sun. She looked at the light as, though it was something she had not seen for a long time. John walked closer, hoping to speak. He said gently, "Do you have a name?" But she gave no answer, only silence. Her lips parted for a moment, but no sound came out. Then she turned away, hiding her face from him. Days began to pass in a strange rhythm. She stayed in the house, always quiet, always watching. John noticed how she moved carefully, as if every corner of the room was new to her. She touched the old wooden table like it was treasure. She stared at firelight as though she had never seen it before. Each small action was filled with wonder, and John realized she was learning about the human world like a child. He tried teaching her simple words. "Water," he said, pointing to the cup. She looked, then repeated softly, "Water." Her voice was soft, broken and beautiful, like music carried by the wind. He smiled for the first time in a long while, and she tilted her head as though curious about his laughter. Slowly, a bond began to form between them, not with many words, but with quiet gestures and shared moments. One evening, John placed a small mirror in front of her. She looked at her reflection for the first time. Her eyes widened and tears welled up. She reached out to touch the glass, as though she was meeting a stranger on the other side. John realized then that she might not have seen her own face for a long time, perhaps ever since she had been taken. He felt anger in his chest for the cruelty of those who sold her, but he said nothing. He only placed his hand gently over hers on the mirror, letting her know she was not alone anymore. Despite the small steps of trust, fear still followed her like a shadow. At night she would wake up suddenly, her body shaking, eyes wide with terror. Sometimes she whispered words in a language John could not understand, strange sounds that made his skin shiver. He would light the lamp and sit near her until she calmed. He said softly, "You are safe here," over and over, hoping she could believe it. But John himself was not free of fear. He often stared at her when she slept, wondering what danger he had brought into his life. She was not human. That much was certain. If others discovered her, they might come for her, or worse, come for him too. And yet, no matter the risk, he could not send her away. His loneliness had already been broken by her presence, and the thought of returning to empty silence was unbearable. One night, as the stars shone bright above the house, John stepped outside. To clear his thoughts, the sky was wide and endless, and he wondered if she came from one of those stars. Did she fall from the heavens? Did she lose her way in the universe and end up here on Earth? He did not know, but he felt that fate had chosen him to protect her, and that choice weighed heavily on his heart. When he returned inside, he found her still awake, sitting by the fire. Her eyes followed him with quiet trust. For the first time, she whispered something, so soft he almost did not hear. It was not a full name, but a single sound, a syllable that meant nothing in human tongue. Yet the way she said it, John understood. It was her name, fragile and secret. She had finally given him a piece of herself. John repeated the sound softly, and she gave the smallest smile. Her first smile. It was like the rising of a hidden sun, filling the room with warmth. In that moment, John knew the girl with no name was no longer just a stranger. She was a part of his life now, and no matter what mysteries lay ahead, he would not let her go. The days grew longer, and the cold of winter slowly gave way to the softer air of spring. John's small house, once filled with silence and dust, now held the quiet presence of the strange girl. She still spoke little, but her eyes followed every movement. Her hands reached slowly toward new objects, and her voice, though rare, carried more power than any word John had heard before. She was not simply a guest anymore. She was becoming part of his daily life. At first, John thought of her as fragile, like a bird with broken wings, but he soon learned she carried strength hidden inside her silence. When she swept the floor, her movements were careful and exact. When she carried water from the well, she balanced the bucket as if she had been doing it for years. Every task she tried, she gave her full focus, as though learning how to live again. John often watched her in wonder, asking himself, how could someone so broken still stand so tall inside? One morning, as John chopped wood behind the house, he noticed her standing by the door. She watched the falling pieces of wood with curious eyes. He smiled and handed her the axe. She looked down at it, unsure. But then, slowly, she swung. The cut was weak, but it split the log halfway. John laughed warmly, clapping his hands. She tilted her head, puzzled by his laughter, and for the first time she let out a small sound, a short laugh of her own. The sound was soft, shy, and beautiful. John felt it echo deep in his chest, warming a place that had been cold for too long. That evening, he decided to teach her more words. He pointed at the axe and said, "Axe," she repeated softly. "Axe." He pointed to the fire. "Fire," she whispered. "Fire." Her voice carried hesitation but also determination. Each word was like a step, building a bridge between two different worlds. When she smiled at her own progress, John realized he had not only given her a voice, he had found his own laughter again. As days turned into weeks, they began to share small routines. John prepared bread while she lit the fire. He fixed the roof while she carried water. Sometimes when work was done, they sat outside under the wide sky. She would point at the stars, her eyes glowing with recognition. John felt she wanted to tell him something about them, but the words were not ready yet. He only nodded as if saying, "I understand, even if you cannot speak." One night, John woke from sleep and found her sitting by the window. The moonlight touched her face, and he saw tears on her cheeks. He approached gently and asked, "Are you afraid?" She shook her head, then touched her chest and whispered, "Alone." The word cut into him like a knife. For the first time, he saw not just sadness, but the deep wound of isolation in her. He sat beside her, his hand resting softly over hers, and said, "Not anymore." Her eyes widened and she nodded slowly, a tear sliding down. It was a promise sealed without more words. The bond between them deepened, not built on grand speeches but on simple moments. She began leaving small things for him, a cup of water ready after his work, a blanket folded near his chair, a smile waiting when he returned home. John, in turn, found himself caring more than he expected. He repaired her shoes with old leather. He saved her the larger portion of food. He even carved a small wooden figure of a bird and placed it near her bed. When she saw it, she pressed it to her chest and whispered, "Thank." Her eyes carried more meaning than the word itself ever could. Still, not everything was peaceful. At times, her silence would grow heavy, and shadows of fear returned. Once, while passing through the town, a group of men laughed at John, pointing at the girl by his side. "Your strange pet." One of them sneered. John clenched his fists but said nothing. He pulled her close and walked away. That night, she avoided. His gaze, ashamed of what she had heard, John gently lifted her chin and said, "You are not a pet, you are not nothing, you are you and you are here with me." Her eyes filled with light again. Slowly, trust became the language they spoke best. Even in silence, they understood each other. John could read the slight curve of her lips, the tilt of her head. The way her hands folded when nervous, she in turn knew when his loneliness pressed heavy on him. She would sit quietly by his side until it passed. They were two broken souls, but together they were mending. As the season turned warmer, John found himself looking at her differently. No longer just a stranger, no longer just someone to protect, but someone who had become part of his heart. She was still a mystery, but she was also comfort. She was the reason he woke with purpose, the reason his house no longer felt empty. One evening, as they sat outside under the stars, she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but for John it was as powerful as 1,000 words. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought of the first night he saw her on that auction stage, sold for $3 like an object. He realized how far she had come and how far he had come too. Their bond was not spoken loudly, nor was it written in grand actions. It was silent, gentle and strong, a thread woven between two lives, invisible yet unbreakable. John knew their journey was only beginning. He did not know where it would lead, but he knew one truth. He would not walk alone anymore, and neither would she. The air was warm and the night sky stretched wide above the small house. Stars burned like silver fire, endless and bright. John sat outside with the girl, their small wooden chairs facing the heavens. He had grown used to her silence, but tonight felt different. Her gaze was not soft curiosity. It was heavy, almost painful. Her fingers twisted the edge of the blanket on her lap, as though she was holding back a storm inside her. For weeks, John had wondered who she really was. He had accepted her presence, cared for her, taught her words, and even laughed with her. But deep in his heart, questions burned. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she sold in chains? He had hidden these questions, fearing they might break the fragile trust between them. Yet tonight, under the cold glow of the stars, he felt an answer was close. He turned to her gently and asked, "Why do you look at the sky like that?" She did not move at first. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then, slowly, she whispered, "Home." The word fell heavy between them. John's breath caught. His heart raced. He leaned closer and said softly, "The stars, they're your home?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving the sky. Then for the first time she began to speak longer. Her voice trembled, broken by fear and memory. "Taken long ago. Hunters." She touched the scar at her wrist, a mark John had noticed but never asked about, her eyes filled with shadow. "They caught me. Sold me." John's chest tightened. His fists curled as anger rose inside him. He pictured her small figure dragged across strange lands, tied, mocked, treated as less than human. His voice shook as he whispered, "You were taken from your people?" She nodded again, more tears sliding down her cheeks. No family, no world. Her words came like sharp fragments, but the meaning struck deep. For the first time, John saw the depth of her loneliness. It was not just the silence of her days, but the silence of a lost universe. She was not only far from home, she had no home to return to. The hunters had taken everything, her world, her family, her freedom. John reached for her hand. His rough fingers brushed against her glowing skin. "You are safe now," he said firmly. She turned her tearful eyes. "To him safe?" she asked, as though the word itself was foreign. He nodded. "Yes, no one will hurt you here, not while I breathe." For a moment, silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was filled with something new, trust, fragile but real. She leaned closer, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. Her body trembled, but her breath slowly grew calm. John tilted his face toward the stars. He thought of her story, of how cruel the world could be. He wondered what kind of universe could allow a child of the stars to fall into such misery. Yet sitting there with her, he also felt something else. Fate. It was fate that had led him to that market, fate that made him speak when no one else cared. That night stretched long. She spoke more, not in full sentences, but in broken words, each one heavy with memory. She told of ships, of cages, of strange voices that shouted commands. She spoke of fear, hunger, and long nights locked in darkness. John listened without interrupting. His chest ached with every word. His heart burned with the thought of her suffering. When she finally grew quiet, her voice fading like the last echo of a song, he whispered, "You are not alone anymore." The fire crackled softly beside them, and the stars shimmered above. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes. There was pain still, but there was also something new, a fragile spark of hope. Her lips curved slightly, not a full smile, but the beginning of one. For John, it was enough. In the days that followed, something changed between them. The girl still spoke little, but the silence was no longer empty. It was shared, filled with quiet understanding. At times, John would catch her humming softly, strange melodies that seemed older than the earth itself. Her voice carried a sorrow that was beautiful and haunting. He never asked her to stop, he only listened, letting the sound fill the hollow spaces of his heart. One evening, she reached out her hand and pointed at a star brighter than the others. Her eyes softened and she whispered a word in her own language. John could not understand it, but he felt the meaning. It was a memory, a piece of the world she had lost. He placed his hand over hers and said, "So we can make a new home here." She looked at him, and this time her small smile was real. John's life had been a long chain of empty days, but now, every moment carried weight. The girl with no name had given him purpose, and though her story was filled with pain, her presence was a light breaking through his darkness. Together, under the endless sky, they had begun to build something fragile but strong. The truth under the stars was clear. She was not of this world. She was not meant for chains. She was a soul searching for belonging, and John, once a lonely man, had promised himself that she would never face that search alone again. The seasons turned again, and with time the bond between John and the alien girl grew stronger. What had once been silence filled slowly with gentle laughter, broken words, and shared work. The house, which once felt like a prison of loneliness, now carried warmth in every corner. John often wondered how such a simple place, a place of broken wood and faded walls, could suddenly feel alive. It was not the house that had changed, it was the people within it. Each morning began with small rituals. John would prepare bread while she placed water to boil. Sometimes she would hum, softly, the strange tunes from her world rising like whispers of forgotten stars. At first, John only listened, but slowly he began to hum along, his deep, rough voice mixing clumsily with her soft notes. She would glance at him with amused eyes, and, for the first time in years, he found himself laughing without guilt. The girl learned quickly. She had once been afraid of fire, but now she cooked simple meals. She had once been clumsy with tools, but now she repaired broken chairs with her careful hands. Together they planted small crops outside the house. The soil was hard, but side by side they pressed seeds into the ground, waiting for life to rise. As green shoots appeared, John felt as though those little plants mirrored their bond, fragile at first but growing stronger every day. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, John sat on the porch carving a piece of wood. The girl watched him, her eyes fixed on the slow shape forming beneath his knife. When he finished, he handed her a small figure, a star with pointed edges. She held it close, her lips trembling into a smile. "Star," she whispered. He nodded. "Star, like you." She blushed faintly, though her skin glowed softly in the twilight, and tucked the carving against her chest. Their bond was no longer just survival. It was no longer just protection. It was something deeper, something that wrapped around both of them quietly. John began to realize he could not imagine life without her. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way her eyes softened when she saw the fire, or the way her head tilted when she listened to birdsong. He did not dare to speak the word forming inside his chest. Love. But he felt it, every time she smiled at him. The girl, too, began to change. Her steps grew lighter, her eyes brighter. She smiled more often, even laughed at his clumsy jokes. She started using more words, practicing them with care. One night, as John stumbled over one of her alien songs, she laughed until tears filled her eyes. Then, gently, she placed her hand over his and whispered, "Happy." It was the first time she had used the word, and John felt his heart swell until it ached. But love, even in simple places, is never free of shadows. The townspeople had begun to whisper. Rumors spread quickly. Some said John had gone mad, keeping a strange creature in his home. Others said the girl was dangerous, cursed, or worse. Hunters, the very men who once sold her, had ears everywhere, and though John and the girl lived quietly, peace was fragile. One afternoon, as John returned from the market with bread and salt, he noticed a pair of men watching him. Their eyes narrowed, their whispers sharp. Fear crawled in his chest. He walked quickly home, but the unease did not leave him. That night, as he sat with the girl by the fire, he told her, "We must be careful. They may come again." Her eyes darkened with fear. She whispered one word, "Hunters." John nodded, pulling her close. "I will not let them take you. Not again." Despite the danger, their bond only deepened. Love grew not in grand gestures, but in small moments. When she placed her hand on his after a long day, when he fixed her torn dress with careful stitches, when they sat under the stars and shared silence that spoke louder than words, these were the threads weaving their hearts. Together, one night under a silver moon, John finally spoke. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. "You are more than fate, more than chance. You are my life now." The girl looked at him with wide eyes. Her lips parted as though she struggled to find words, then slowly she whispered, "You bird, mine." She touched her chest, then placed her hand on his. Her meaning was clear. They were no longer two lonely souls. They were something more, something whole. The nights after that were filled with deeper peace. They did not need to declare their love again. It lived in every action, every glance, every breath they shared. But the shadow of Hunters still lingered. John knew danger was close. He could see it in the wary looks of strangers. He could feel it in the unease of his own heart. Yet as long as she was beside him, he was ready to face whatever storm might come. Love had found them in a broken world. It was strange, fragile, and unexpected. Yet it was real, and it gave them the strength to keep going. They had planted something that no fear could destroy. A bond born not only from loneliness but from hope. And though shadows circled outside, within their small house love burned brighter than ever before. The peace John and the alien girl had built was fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. For weeks, they lived quietly, working side by side, sharing food, sharing laughter. Their bond grew strong, but the outside world was not blind. The whispers in town spread wider, and eyes began to follow John whenever he walked the streets. Shadows gathered at the edge of their simple happiness. One evening, as the sun sank low, John returned from the market with a heavy heart. He had felt the stares of men, heard their cruel jokes whispered behind his back. "The strange man and his creature," they said. John ignored them, but fear gnawed at him as he stepped through the door. The girl noticed the tightness in his jaw. She asked softly, "Danger?" He nodded, his voice low. "Yes. The Hunters may know where we are." That night, he did not sleep. He sat near the window, staring into the darkness. The girl curled close to the fire, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Every sound outside made John's hand tighten around the small axe he kept near. He had once lived in silence, but now he had something to protect, and he would fight with his last breath if needed. Days passed, and the tension only grew. Rumors turned into threats. John noticed footprints near the house that were not his. He saw figures watching from a distance, then vanishing before he could call out. The girl grew restless. Her old fear. Returning, she whispered the word hunters again and again. Her hands shook as though the memories of chains and cages clawed back into her mind. John held her close, repeating the same words each time. I will not let them take you. But shadows are patient, and one night they struck. The air was cold, the moon hidden by clouds. John woke to the sound of boots outside. Heavy and certain, he leapt from his chair, grabbing the axe. The girl stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror. A loud bang shook the door, and a voice roared, Open it! Hand her over, and maybe we'll spare you. John's heart thundered. Fear wrapped around him, but his love burned stronger. Stay behind me, he whispered to her. The door splintered as the hunters forced their way in. Two men stepped into the house, rough faces lit by greed and cruelty. Their eyes locked. On the girl. There she is. One sneered. The Star Child. John stepped forward, axe raised. You will not take her, he growled. The hunters laughed. She isn't yours, old fool, she belongs to us. Rage boiled in John's chest. He swung the axe, striking the first man's arm. The hunter cursed and stumbled back. The second lunged, but John shoved him away. The fight was clumsy and brutal, furniture crashing, firewood scattering. The girl pressed against the wall, trembling, her breath shallow. Then, in the chaos, something awakened inside her. Her eyes blazed with light, brighter than any fire. Her hands trembled, then lifted. A burst of energy erupted, pure and blinding. The hunters staggered, screaming as the strange force threw them back. Their weapons clattered to the floor. The house shook as though the stars themselves had entered. John turned to her in shock, his breath caught. The girl's body glowed faintly, her face etched with fear and strength. She looked at him, tears streaming. I protect, she whispered. Her voice was steady, not broken. John dropped the axe and pulled her close. You did, he whispered back. You saved us. The hunters crawled out, defeated. But John knew this was not the end. They had seen her power, and men like them would not give up so easily. They would return with more, stronger, hungrier. For now they had survived, but the shadow had only thickened. The girl collapsed into his arms, exhausted. Her glow faded, leaving her weak. John carried her to the chair by the fire. He brushed the hair from her face, whispering, You are not alone, we will face them together. Her eyes fluttered open, and she whispered one word, Together, before drifting into restless sleep. All night John sat awake, his axe near, his heart heavy. He stared at the stars beyond the window, wondering how long they could keep running. He had thought love was enough to shield them, but now he understood. Love was not a shield. It was the reason he would fight harder, stronger, longer. The next morning, the house still bore scars of the fight, broken wood, scattered ash, dark stains. The girl moved slowly, her strength not fully returned. John helped her stand, and as they looked at the small home they had built, he realized something. They could not stay. Not here. Not where shadows lurked so close. He looked at her and said, We must go, find a safer place. She nodded, fear in her eyes, but also trust. She whispered, With you? John squeezed her hand. Always with me. As they packed what little they owned, John felt the weight of the world pressing down. The hunters were not just men. They were a storm chasing them, but he was no longer the lonely man he once was. He was a man with a purpose, with someone to protect, someone who had become his life. The shadows had found them, but John swore the shadows would never win. With her by his side, he would face the darkness no matter the cost. The road away from the small town was long, and the world ahead was unknown. John walked with a pack on his back and the girl by his side. Their old house, with its memories of laughter, firelight, and fear, faded. Behind them, they did not look back. There was nothing left for them there, only shadows waiting to strike again. What they carried forward was far more precious, a bond strong enough to survive any storm. They traveled through forests and valleys. Sleeping, under open skies at night, the girl would look up at the stars, whispering words in her own language. John could not understand them, but he felt their meaning. They were prayers, memories, promises. He would watch her eyes glow softly under the silver moon and feel a strange peace, as if the universe itself was finally listening to her voice. Their journey was hard, but it was also filled with quiet, beauty. They shared bread under trees, water from rivers, and warmth from small fires. The girl grew stronger with each passing day. Her fear began to fade, replaced by a steady courage. John, too, found himself changing. He was no longer just a man protecting a stranger. He was a partner, a husband in his heart, a father to the future he now dreamed of. One evening, after many days of walking, they reached a meadow surrounded by tall hills. The grass waved gently, and the air was filled with the sound of birds. The place was quiet, hidden, safe. John looked around and said, "Here, we can build again." The girl nodded, her eyes shining. For the first time, she smiled without fear. Together, they built a small home with their own hands. It was humble, but it was theirs. Each nail John hammered, each stone the girl placed, carried more meaning than riches. When the walls were raised and the roof set, they sat together inside, holding hands. Their hearts knew this was not just a house, this was a new beginning. In the quiet of that meadow, love blossomed fully. It was no longer hidden in silence or whispered in broken words. It was spoken. In every glance, every touch, every shared moment, John and the girl, once broken by loneliness and fear, now belonged to each other completely. Under the wide sky, with no one to judge them, they stood before the stars and made their promise. They married not with papers or priests, but with hearts bound by truth. John whispered, "Forever," and she answered, "Always." Time passed, and their home filled with life. The girl's laughter echoed through the meadow, and John's once quiet heart was now full. Then, one morning, their love gave them a new gift. A child, half human, half alien, but fully theirs. John held the tiny life in his arms, his rough hands trembling, his eyes blurred with tears. The girl watched, her face glowing with pride. "Family," she whispered. John nodded, unable to speak. The word was enough. Years went by and their family grew. More children came, each one carrying the strange beauty of their mother and the steady strength of their father. The meadow that was once silent now rang. With voices, laughter, and footsteps, John would sit on the porch, watching his children chase fireflies, while the girl hummed songs of her lost world. They were no longer two lonely souls. They were a family, woven together across stars and blood, but the shadows of the past were never fully gone. At times, John worried the hunters would return. Yet as he watched his children play, he realized something. Even if shadows came, even if danger rose again, he would not be afraid, because now he had something stronger than fear, stronger than loneliness. He had love, and love had given him a family beyond worlds. The girl never forgot her lost planet. Sometimes she would sit outside at night, staring at the brightest star, her eyes soft with longing. John would sit beside her, wrapping his arm around her. "Do you miss it?" he asked once. She shook her head slowly. "I miss, but I have here." She touched his hand, then her chest, and finally pointed toward the house where their children slept. John kissed her forehead, whispering, "This is home." She smiled, and for the first time, her heart truly believed it. The man who once bought a silent stranger for $3 had become more than he ever imagined. He had found not just love, but meaning. He had built not just a house, but a world. His loneliness had given birth to a legacy, one that would carry forward in the laughter of children who were both human and alien, both earth and star. On quiet nights when the meadow was still and the sky stretched wide, John would sit outside with his wife and children. He would look at the stars and remember the night he first saw her on that auction stage, head covered by a sack, body trembling with fear, sold as nothing, treated as worthless, and he would hold her hand tighter, knowing she was everything. Their story was never meant to be ordinary. It was strange, broken, and filled with danger, yet it was also beautiful. A lonely man and a lost girl had found each other, had loved, had fought, and had built a family that crossed the boundaries of worlds. They had proven that even in the darkest places, love could take root, grow, and shine brighter than the stars themselves.